but he played in a sort of music form.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here in Brussels for this conference. Hello to all people connected online, because as you know today, this is a way to organize conferences and to be connected online. So we have many people from outside. We have a simultaneous translation in German, English, French, and Romanian, as we have many Romanian professionals interested by the topic. So, hello to everybody. With my position of president of the European Tax Advisors Federation, it's a great honor for me today to welcome you at this conference. You know that we used to organize 2 conferences a year, and this one we speak on the from the agreement to implementation. That's the title. Where do we stand with the OECD 2-pillar solution? This is a topic on the table today. We are all waiting for that. We are all ready to move forward, but it is an opportunity to analyze the situation and to update our knowledge of the topic. Before entering the very heart of the topic and give the floor to our great panelists, let me briefly come back to the genesis of this agreement and on the role that we, the tax advisors, have to play in the implementation of this landmark agreement. I think it's fair to say that it has been a bumpy road, that a lot has been achieved already, but that we are not yet completely on the final way. The genesis of the OECD 2-pillar solution can be traced back to the recognition that digitalization of the economy has fundamentally changed the way business operate and generate profits. That's a basic point, starting point. There was a broad consensus among countries around the world to start a collective reflection to rethink the international tax rules. And as early as 2013, 10 years ago, the OECD launched the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, the BEPS, well known as BEPS project. In the meantime, at the EU level and an increasing number of member states decided to take unilateral measures in response to this challenge. To avoid a risk of fragmentation of the single market, the European Commission came up in 2018 with a European solution, including a proposal for an interim tax on revenues resulting from certain digital services. In March 2019, the EU finance ministers failed to agree on this proposal, and the ball went back in the hand of the OECD. After years of negotiations, a breakthrough was achieved in July 2021, where an agreement was reached on a declaration setting out the key elements of the international corporate tax reform. And in October 2021, 136 countries adhered to a more detailed statement to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. The 2-pillar solution was born quite recently. In October 2021, Pillar 1 focuses on reallocating taxing rights over multinational enterprises from their home countries to the markets where they generate profits. I would like to mention that ETAF has been a precursor in this matter. Already in 2016, that was our launching conference, ETAF sent a white paper to the Commissioner Pierre Moscovici about precisely this topic. At that time, only very few people understood the dimension of digitalization and how important it was to shape a fiscal policy that accurately tackled this issue. ETAF also pushed for and welcomed the agreement on Pillar 2, introducing a minimum 15% effective tax rates for large multinational enterprises, as it will contribute to a fairer distribution of tax revenues and a fairer tax system. In a 2022 position paper on the directive implementing Pillar 2 within the EU, we very much insisted on the necessity to ensure uniform implementation at EU and OECD levels, and warned that the timeline for implementation will be challenging for tax professionals. This brings me to the role of tax advisors in implementing the OECD solution. It is our responsibility to provide clear and practical advice to our clients to help them navigating the complexities of these new rules in order to comply. And it is the responsibility of policymakers to give us the right tools to do so, with enough guidance and certainty in this legal text. As we move forward, tax advisors must stand ready and be prepared to any future development, including, who knows, a lowering of the threshold and the event of an application of the new rules to smaller companies in the future. That will come anyway. This being said, let's come back to the question of the day. More than 2 years after the OECD landmark agreement, where do we stand in terms of implementation? For Pillar 2, the deadline was the transposition in the EU set for 31st December 2023, tomorrow, is approaching. Are we ready? What challenges do we face? For Pillar 1, recent progress has been made at OECD, but what chances do we have of having a critical mass of jurisdictions signing and ultimately implementing, and what role the US play? And what impact does this uncertainty have on taxpayers? Finally, we cannot ignore the actuality and the recent vote to start negotiation at the United Nations for a legally binding framework convention on international tax cooperation. So far, the OECD has always led international tax negotiations, almost ready to issue its project. We know that the vote of European member states was negative against this United Nations initiative. So, what will be the impact of this change of forum, if any? To answer all these questions, we have a high-level panel of speakers today who will share with us their insight and their expertise. Please join me in welcoming two must-have speakers on this topic. Reinhard Biebel, Head of Unit Direct Tax Policy and Cooperation at the DG TaxUD of the European Commission. Thank you for being with us. And David Bradbury, Deputy Director of the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration, who is joining us online due to a last-minute impediment. So thank you, David. Jorge Alberto Ferreras Gutierrez, Financial Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Spain to the EU, is also with us today to give us an update and, on the work under the Spanish presidency of the Council of the EU. Mona Barak, who will give the perspective of the EU Tax Observatory, as she is a postdoctoral researcher there. To represent the tax profession, we are happy to welcome Christoph Markgraber, partner at KPMG and member of the Pillar 2 working group at our Australian member, KSW. He will be connected online for keeping for himself the virus COVID recently caused, and we thank him for that. So thank you, Christophe, to being with us, and we know that you do your best, and we appreciate a lot. Last but not least, our panel moderator, Rebecca Christie, columnist for Reuters, Breaking News, and the senior fellow at Bruegel. So Rebecca, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming today, those of you in the room, those of you online, likewise speakers. Speakers, I can see you on a small screen, so I will call to you as we go through, but also if you raise your hand, I will attempt to come back in. We are going to discuss Pillar 2 of the OECD Grand Deal first, followed by Pillar 1. We will have some discussion among the panel on each of these topics, and then if there is time for Q&A, it will be at the very end for all topics. So with that in mind, David, we would love it if you could update us on where we stand on Pillar 2. How are things looking? What are next steps?
Great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. Great to join you. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there with you all. And thanks very much, Philippe, for the introduction that I think did such a wonderful job in setting the scene for today's discussions. In terms of Pillar 2, obviously there are two elements to Pillar 2. There's the global minimum tax and there's the subject to tax rule. And good progress is being made on both of those elements. The subject to tax rule, of course, we have finalised the MLC text, and that has been open for signature. And it's now a question of countries entering into those arrangements. So good progress has been made, certainly at the technical level, and now we await action from the countries. On the global minimum tax, there has been considerable progress there as well. And of course, for many jurisdictions, it will begin to take effect from the 1st of January next year. And just to give a little bit of sense of the scale of what's occurring on the global minimum tax, we estimate that at this point about 55 jurisdictions are taking steps towards implementation. And that is not, it's not 145 jurisdictions that we now have in the inclusive framework on BEPS, but we don't need all of those jurisdictions to implement for this to be globally effective. And I just want to spend a few moments explaining how that is the case. Firstly, the global minimum tax rules are what we describe as a common approach. And that means it's not mandatory for countries that have agreed to this agreement to implement the global minimum tax. But if they do choose to implement, they are committing to doing so in a manner that is consistent with the rules that have been agreed. That's the first element. But the second element is that even if they're not implementing the rules themselves, the agreement means that they are willing to respect the application of those rules by other jurisdictions. And when you look at the architecture of the global minimum tax, and in particular with the cascading sets of taxing rights that are allocated, and just stepping back for 1 minute, obviously we've got the 750 million euro threshold, so companies above that threshold that are in scope. It will depend on the effective tax rate at the jurisdictional level. And to the extent that companies are experiencing or benefiting from effective tax rates below that 15% in a jurisdiction, there is, of course, the option for the source jurisdiction to collect that top-up tax. They can do that in any number of ways, but we provide the QDMTT, the Qualified Domestic Minimum Top-Up Tax, as one mechanism through which they might seek to take the first bite of the cherry, if you like. If they choose not to collect that top-up tax, then the next taxing right goes to the jurisdiction of the headquarters. And if neither of those jurisdictions seeks to exercise the taxing right, then we have the backstop rule, which is the under-taxed profits rule, the UTPR. And the UTPR essentially allows a taxing right that is connected to any subsidiary of the multinational that is within a jurisdiction that has implemented these rules. Now, the UTPR, there is a slight delay on the implementation of that because it was always envisaged that there would be a transition. But I spent a little bit of time going through these rules to just demonstrate that you do not need 100% of countries to implement the global minimum tax for it to be globally effective. And in fact, if we take the countries that have already committed to implementing the global minimum tax, we estimate that by 2025, when the UTPR will begin to take effect, we estimate that around 90% of in-scope multinationals will be within the net of the global minimum tax with the countries that have already announced. So, of course, there are other countries that we're expecting to continue to make announcements around implementation, but already we are reaching a point where there is a very strong degree of coverage across the globe. So I think it's important to note all of those dimensions. And of course, we continue to work with all 145 members of the inclusive framework on revising guidance as we move forward. It's a balancing act between making sure we respond to the needs of taxpayers and the tax advising community when it comes to guidance, but also doing that in an expeditious fashion, but also doing it in a way that minimises any uncertainty. And of course, with any major reform of this nature that's being implemented at the global level, there will, of course, need to be some agility in being able to respond to various issues that policymakers just cannot anticipate in advance. And we've certainly shown a willingness to do that. So I'll leave my remarks there, other than to just conclude by saying that I think the global minimum tax is already a reality. It certainly will be from the 1st of January in many countries. And I want to, in particular, acknowledge what I think has been the real circuit breaker in all of this, and that was the decision of the EU member states last year to adopt the EU directive. I really think that once the EU member states took that action, it was really almost a series of dominoes that have begun to fall in terms of countries moving towards implementation.
Thanks very much for that. Jorge, can you talk about what member states have been doing since then and where we stand now, please?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation today. I mean, I think that the great work was made last year in the Council. I mean, it was the main issue for the Pillar 2, which was during the French presidency, and as you know, it was agreed at the end of the Czech presidency. But during this year, there's been also some work that has been done in the Council that I would like to mention. First of all, during the Spanish presidency, I mean, the week of the July ECOFIN, it was exactly the same one as when the outcome statement at the OECD in July was issued. So in that ECOFIN, the Spanish presidency informed about all of that. I mean, it was particularly relevant for the Pillar 2 issue since the administrative guidance was approved. I mean, it was agreed exactly the same day at the July ECOFIN, so it was, right on time. So that was, that showed the high interest that it was expressed by the ministers at that time. It was really the hot topic that week. But I would also like to mention that all the member states have been very involved in coordinating among ourselves in all these topics around the Pillar 2 implementation, since there's really a lot of issues to be correctly interpreted. And so there's been a lot of work around among ourselves and together with the Commission. And I think that we've been trying to coordinate on this one. But I would also like to mention, I mean, of course, this is really important for all of us to interpret the things in the same way. But especially important, it was in November ECOFIN, where a statement by the Council was adopted at the same time as a statement which was issued by the Commission. That statement also showed the importance and all. Welcome all the progress that has been already commented by David and by Philip. A lot of things have been going on at the OECD. So we thought as Spanish presidency it was right on time to express support for all those issues. And in that statement, we welcome all this progress, and in particular, one of the issues that is mentioned by the Commission in its statement, which is that the administrative guidance, which is being published and it's been agreed at the OECD level, is compatible with the Pillar 2 directive. It's important because you know that the directive has been approved last year, and this administrative guidance has been evolving during this year, December, and even last July, February, and last July. So it is important, this view from the Commission as interpreter of the treaties, that it's everything is fine. So for us as member states, we also stated the importance of not achieving the importance of being consistent in the implementation with of the Pillar 2 directive with all this guidance which is being issued by the OECD, in order not to find differences or different standards. So that's what we stated. And we mentioned the importance of the recitals of the Pillar 2 directive, where this is also mentioned. Last year, when Pillar 2 was approved, we all knew that this guidance was evolving, and so that's why we already stated in the recitals that this guidance could be used as a source of interpretation. So I think that's what's really good on time, because as it's been mentioned, member states are right now in this process of preparing the implementation. So it's very good that we have this kind of work of achieving a coordinated way of interpretation. So I will leave here.
Thanks for that. Reinhard, can you tell us where the Commission is in working with the member states as they do this, and how's it looking for right now?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to ETAF for the invitation. We are very happy to come to these events and to explain what we are doing in the Commission with member states and with stakeholders. Let me start by saying that we think that Pillar 2, as David said, is reality. The minimum effective taxation has become reality. And that is a very big development. And I say it's a very positive development. If we look back 5 years from today, I think nobody would have imagined that 140 states sitting around the table would come to a conclusion that a global minimum effective tax rate should be the way forward. Now, we know that not all of those 140 states have decided to implement it for the time being. There are 55, and that includes 27 EU member states. And therefore, I would say that also the directive that has been agreed together with the 27 member states is a success. I know that not everybody in this room and outside there may share this view, But we think that without the EU directive, we would not have seen Pillar 2 materializing. It has given the whole project the necessary kick to move ahead. Now, why do we think that the global solution is the best one in this field? Because, as the President has mentioned in the introduction, there were several attempts already to solve the issues, the problems that have been identified without success. And we don't think that for this issue, a national or a regional solution can help. The Commission has therefore been very supportive of the two-pillar solution from the start. Now, there are challenges. We are not ignorant. We are fully aware that there are big challenges currently in front of us, and there will still be challenges in a couple of years. Yesterday I've been at a conference with many people from business and advisors in the audience, and one speaker said, I'm looking into very many tired faces. And I think this is true. Everybody is working really hard to get Pillar 2 implemented. And the problem is the timeline. Yes, time is very short. However, it's not possible to change the directive just like that and say, okay, let's give ourselves another year or two. That's one thing. The other problem I would see is where are we with legal certainty, knowing that the administrative guidance of the OECD is still developing as we speak. And Jorge has hinted at an important step in this context, that the ECOFIN Council adopted a statement early November that says that the administrative guidance issued by the OECD is compatible with the EU directive. We think this is a major step forward to provide also legal certainty to all stakeholders that have to advise and have to implement the directive. We as a Commission, we are trying to do what we can to talk to member states, to identify questions, to find answers to questions. We have discussed more than 400 questions with the member states. It's very intense, it's very complicated, very technical, but it's necessary in order to ensure the consistent implementation of the directive. And we will continue to do so in order to make sure that the implementation will work. Where are we with the transposition? And we know that there's not much time left until the end of this year. I would say it is more or less with all transitions of EU directives. It's going more or less fine, more or less well. But there's always a risk that it goes better for some member states and is a bit more difficult for other member states. Just depending on the situation, there may be elections in some countries which hold up the process. There may be resource limitations in other countries that hold up the process. We as a Commission, we try to help and smoothen that process as much as we can. So far, we are still very optimistic that all member states will transpose the directive in time and in a comprehensive way. Important to note that probably not all member states will transpose it, because the directive includes a derogation in Article 50, which says that if you have not more than 12 groups in your national jurisdiction that meet the scope limitation, then you get a bit more time to implement the IIR and the UTPR, exactly 6 years. And we know that there will be member states opting for this derogation, so it will not be 27 in the end, as from 2024. So to sum up, we think Pillar 2 is a big achievement globally. We believe and still fully support the two-pillar solution as a Commission. Preferably, we would like to see more non-EU jurisdictions to join the Pillar 2 concept and mechanism. That would be definitely our preference. At the same time, we know that it can work also without them. Nevertheless, it would be nice to see more joining. We continue to do our best to make the transposition, but also then the implementation as smooth as possible. And we also, where it will take time to see first results. We are not talking about next year or the year after. It takes time to implement it. It takes time to enforce it, and it takes time until the first tax audits will also in practice check how the new system will work in practice. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much for that. Christoph, you are someone who works with the implementation of this, and we very much appreciate your joining us today. Would love to hear your thoughts on what it will be like putting this into practice, particularly given the regional variations in how Pillar 2 is being adopted.
Yeah, thank you very much. My voice, unfortunately, doesn't sound like it usually sounds because I'm still suffering from COVID. That's also the reason why I fortunately was not able to join you at this conference personally. Still, I'm happy that I can contribute a little bit virtually here. I just want to give an overview of how I experienced the implementation as an advisor and also from the perspective of the companies. Coming from Austria, just as an information, for example, we have around 120 M&E groups headquartered in Austria that are covered by those rules. And we expect that we have about 6,500 entities in Austria that will be covered by those rules. Yeah? So when thinking back, when the OECD published the model rules in 21, and then the directive was published, I think, shortly before Christmas. Christmas is always hard time. I'm always afraid there's something new coming up right before Christmas with Pillar 2. However, most of the companies in Austria, honestly, they started to think more thoroughly about Pillar 2 not before the Austrian implementation law was published. Yeah? So the models by the OECD as well as the directive were, for most companies, I would not say ignored, yeah? But it did not let them to start an implementation process. Yeah? That really started when our local law as a draft was published, which has not been done before October this year, yeah? So from last month. So you can see in practice that, at least in Austria, there were a lot of groups and entities that are covered which have not started the implementation process before last month, I would say. Yeah? And the difficulty is first that in the Austrian law, for example, we have around 60 pages, only the law. You have a lot of commentary, you have the administrative guidance of the OECD and so on. So the first hurdle for most companies and also for us as advisors is the huge amount of information and rules that you have to cover and go through just to understand what Pillar 2 is all about and what to do. There are, of course, complexities in the rule that need to be dealt with. However, there are also some issues in the Pillar 2 rules which lead to practical challenges, like, for example, that the idea is to start the Pillar 2 calculations with the financial accounts based on the consolidated financial statements. Yeah? So the idea basically is each and every entity of a group has individual financial statements based on the consolidated financial statements. Yeah? So if the consolidated financial statements are based on IFRS, the idea is that each entity has IFRS individual financial statements, which is not the case with respect to most companies. What they have is are so-called reporting packages, yeah, which are needed to come up with the consolidated financial statements, but those reporting packages differ from a fully correct IFRS single financial statement. Yeah? So already at the beginning, before even starting with the complexities of the rule, you have the practical challenges that you think about do I need to adapt my financial reporting process in order to put in new or other information in my financial accounts in order to be prepared to even start with what Pillar 2 requires? Another issue is, of course, what has already been mentioned. There are the OECD rules, there is the EU directive. However, the rules need to be implemented by each and every country. So multinationals currently face the challenge that they need to screen each jurisdiction where they are operating to be aware, does this jurisdiction implement Pillar 2? In which way? Do they have a QDMTT? Can I apply the QDMTT safe harbor? Am I within the scope of the temporary safe harbors? Yes or no? And all of those questions cannot, most of the time, cannot be answered 100% sure. Yeah? So you, at the moment, you have some uncertainty with respect to which countries will adopt the various rules in which way, and also which kind of safe harbor rules can be applied in 24 when they have to be applied. Currently, what you do is let's say a best guess based on historical information, on information you can find partly online. So of course, you might know that there are implementation trackers available online on how each and every jurisdiction at which point of time they are in the process of implementing the Pillar 2 rules. But of course, it's very difficult in practice to know, okay, are those rules in line with the requirements for a QDMTT safe harbor, for example? Yeah? So we are doing a lot of estimations and best guesses, yeah, in order to know, okay, which countries do we need to concentrate on for the Pillar 2 calculations next year. So this is one of the big challenges you see, yeah, and of course also that multinationals and companies have not yet fully understood what the rules are about and what they are required to do in the next couple of months and so on. I would say that's basically the first input I can give from my experience within the last 2 years.
Thanks very much for that. Mona, how is this looking for you? And in particular, how should we think about what this does to the global outlook? Because before, certainly on the EU side, there was concern that if people went ahead with Pillar 2, that Pillar 1 would be slowed down. We're still talking about Pillar 2, but we are, of course, looking to the second half of our conversation. So I'll throw that over to you.
Thank you. First, thank you for ETAF for the invitation. So a few remarks on Pillar 2 from a research perspective. At the EU Tax Observatory, we were interested in the last 2 years in trying to give estimates around how much each country would get from Pillar 2. And of course, Pillar 2 looks promising because it might curb this race to the bottom in corporate tax rates around the world. But there are a few aspects that we were trying to assess because they might affect potential revenues. So first, you all know that there's already GILTI that exists in parallel, which is like the Pillar 2 of the US. So we were not very sure how this would interact with Pillar 2 and if GILTI would apply before Pillar 2, like before the QDMTT or the income inclusion rule. So there are, of course, it's important to see the priority and implementation, what would come first, because this might affect the revenues that would be collected by countries. And of course, speaking about this, other than GILTI, there's the CFC rules. Are they going to be applied before QDMTT or what? So I think there's some clarifications that needs to be done with respect to what would apply first and how. And second as well, tax credits. So you've all probably, you've seen that there's different treatment of the tax credits when we're calculating the revenues from Pillar 2. And many governments, especially and those of the countries that are considered as tax havens or investment hubs are probably going to introduce tax credits, which would, of course, from a side, the governments are collecting the revenues from Pillar 2, but this is going to be like a loophole where some governments might pay back these revenues to the multinationals. So also we should be careful about the loopholes that might arise. And finally, probably about the carve-outs. So we were also trying to assess whether there's going to be some behavioral responses of multinationals, because as you know, in carve-outs, the multinational could subtract from the tax base a certain amount of that is proportional to the number of employees and the amount of assets in the country. So we were also wondering if some multinationals would have some incentives to move some of their employees or assets in low tax jurisdiction to benefit the most and to maximize how much they can reduce the tax payments from Pillar 2. So these are the three aspects that I had in mind. With respect to Pillar 1, so going back to your question, could you just
Sure, and the question is, there were people who said that if we went ahead with Pillar 2, that Pillar 1 would be stuck forever if they were not linked in the implementation.
Yes, sir. So of course there's some connection between the two, but so far they have been treated separately. Some countries were insisting on the implementation of Pillar 2 with Pillar 1 because maybe some countries see potential in Pillar 1, and that's because maybe for them Pillar 2 doesn't generate much. I mean, Pillar 2, it would generate revenues for countries that either, if you're looking at the QDMTT perspective, you have to be a country that have a lot of multinationals that are operating there. Otherwise, you're not going to expect much revenues. And in parallel, if you're expecting revenues from the income inclusion rule, you have to be a country that have a lot of multinationals that are operating in low tax jurisdictions. Otherwise, under these two scenarios, countries wouldn't expect much. So probably the idea of Pillar 1, which is also very interesting. So it's of course different because Pillar 1 consists of reallocating taxing rights to countries, even if the multinational is not operating physically in the country. And this speaks much more to the digitalization of the economy, maybe a bit more than Pillar 2. And I think many countries see potential in the idea of Pillar 1, and they were probably looking forward for something that looks like a Pillar 1 or a digital tax than necessarily Pillar 2.
Thanks. David, as we close out the first half of our conversation, would you like to speak, or can you speak to us about the differences in how different jurisdictions are implementing this and the different speeds? Reinhard was saying some EU countries might take many years to get there. How is this affecting how we move forward?
Well, I think the first point to make is that there is something of a first mover advantage in the sense that if a country does implement these rules before others, then it is likely to be able to collect any top-up tax that is payable before other jurisdictions are able to do so. So to some extent, once jurisdictions form the view that this is coming at some point, then we see some advantage in moving faster rather than later. And of course, if a sufficient number of countries have these rules in place, and as I indicated before, taking into account those that are already intending to implement, covering about 90% of in-scope multinationals, then you already see that the rules will start to have effect. If I can just address one issue in particular, and this is around the extent to which there may be benefits from the global minimum tax for different types of countries.
Că în funcție de tipul de țară, beneficiul poate fi diferit.
Research that we released just a week ago is a new working paper that highlights something that is perhaps a little counterintuitive, and that is that there is a lot of low tax profit in jurisdictions that are high taxed, that have either high statutory tax rates or even have high average effective tax rates. And that's because often tax incentives are targeted towards a small number of firms or particular firms in a jurisdiction. So I think this is a really important finding. And in fact, we find that more than half of the low tax profit across the globe, and our definition of low tax profit is profit that is subject to an effective tax rate of less than 15%. So more than half of the low tax profit across the globe is located in jurisdictions that have a statutory tax rate above 15%. So this is incredibly important, I think, for developing countries who often have higher statutory tax rates. And it's in particular because quite often you see tax holidays, for example, granted to particular multinationals. And that can mean zero tax rate, or maybe even less if there are other forms of tax support in addition to the tax holiday that are being provided. So I think it is worth noting that these rules, and in particular the QDMTT, gives the source jurisdiction the first opportunity to claim the top-up tax. But because we are seeing jurisdictions, a significant number of them, implementing the three rules, that means that if other countries don't act, they are going to be in a situation, in effect, particularly when the UTPR comes into effect, where multinationals operating in their jurisdiction are going to be subject to the minimum tax rate, whether they implement the rules or not. So what has previously been the advantage in having a lower effective tax rate in your jurisdiction to try and attract foreign direct investment, that benefit will to some extent evaporate, and the top-up tax will be collected by another jurisdiction. I think that's something that in many countries, from a political economy perspective, it will be very difficult to justify people sitting on their hands and not implementing the rules if they see that top-up tax on activity in their jurisdiction is being collected by some other country.
Love it, top-up tax as a way of cross-border compliance. We will now move into the second half of our conversation. So Reinhard, back to you. If there's anything you'd like to add to what David said, please feel free to do that first, and then we'll head into the next section.
No, I think I would like to add something that Mona also hinted at, is whether Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 should be seen as a package. I think that's a very interesting question. I don't think we have ever said that they can only be adopted as a package. They are not twins that you cannot deal with one without the other. But the Commission has always been supportive of both. And if you look at the Pillar 2 directive, there's even a reference in there to Pillar 1, which says the Commission should carefully monitor the progress made on Pillar 1 once Pillar 2 is now agreed. So logically, there is, of course, a certain link. It's a two-pillar solution. And the way jurisdictions look at it is probably driven, and that's a very simple approach, by where do I get more revenues from? You hinted at it, Mona. And I think that's a very natural reaction. The same way some states might argue, why should I introduce such a complicated system that I have trouble to monitor when I know I will not get any dollar or euro more from it. So that's a bit the fine balance that we all have to find and make sure that despite the complexity and all the efforts, the outcome is still positive. There's still something to gain from it overall. Not for everyone probably, but overall there should be a positive outcome. I think that's an important element I wanted to add.
Thanks very much. Moving on to Pillar 1, where do we stand in the EU? How does this fit with BFIT, with ratification? What's going on?
Now you're with ratification and BFIT, we are jumping a bit ahead, I would say. Let's look at Pillar 1 as such first, and we all know Pillar 1 is a slightly different animal as compared to Pillar 2. Pillar 1 requires a multilateral convention. It deals with the reallocation of taxing rights So it's a slightly different design. Also, if you look at the scope, we are talking about, I don't know where we are now, between 80 and 100 MNEs worldwide. Whereas with Pillar 2, we're talking about quite a lot of companies, even in the EU, a couple of thousand. So it's a completely different impact in a way. At the same time, the amount of profits that is going to re-attributed is limited as well. In a way, it's not the big chunk of profits, it's residual profits that are well defined in the Pillar 1 drafts. Nevertheless, the Commission has always been supportive, as I said, and still is. There may be people out there who say, I don't believe actually that Pillar 1 will ever see the daylight, and there may be arguments for it. We don't share that view as a Commission. We still believe it's worthwhile investing, it's worthwhile finding solutions, and it's important that the key jurisdictions also sign up to it. Therefore, we fully support the finalization of the MLC, the signature, which is the next step. And then, of course, there is a step called ratification, which is a little bit out of our hands. Then it goes into the political sphere. And actually nobody knows or can predict how it will be dealt with there. But we all hope that it's still a reasonable scenario. What is positive in terms of developments recently? We think that the fact that the draft MLC has been published on the 11th of October by the OECD is a major step forward, because now we see that we are very close to a final text. There are also several hundred pages of explanatory statement that if you haven't read it, you may spend some time over Christmas to read it through. Interesting literature. We should not ignore that there are still footnotes, so-called footnotes in that draft, which reflect still some doubts and some issues that could have not been resolved yet. There are issues still with India, with Brazil, Colombia. There are some issues with Canada and DSTs. So not everything is resolved, but we think it's a positive signal. It's also very positive in that context that the US Treasury has immediately started their consultation on it, and that was the reason for why the process has been slightly delayed. We would have wished, as a European Union, to have the MLC already ready for signature this year, but we also accept that the US mainly needs a bit more time until the 11th of December, when this consultation should be finalized or finished. We hope that this will give a positive impetus, that the feedback is positive from business, but also Congress, to which it is addressed. There's still a risk that new issues may come up and will be referred back to the OECD. Who knows? We hope not, because that would delay the process definitely further. And speaking about the US, of course, we all know what the elephant in the room is on Pillar 1. We need a critical mass. Also a bit different to Pillar 2. If you look at the definition of the critical mass, it's very clear that some countries need to be on board, and the US is one of them. Pillar 1 will not fly without the US, and we cannot say we don't care about the rest of the world. The EU is going ahead with Pillar 1. It doesn't make sense. So we need the other jurisdictions and big economic areas in the scope. So we hope that this is going well. We see positive signals so far, but at the same time, we see the risk that the longer the process takes, the higher the risks become that the US will say, now it's getting really difficult for us. We are getting closer to elections, and we have good intentions, but politically we cannot make it. And that would be a real a real pity. So we as a Commission, we are trying to help if we can and push the process further, at least get to the stage of where the final MSC can be signed, and hope that as many jurisdictions as possible really sign it then. Let's not forget about Amount B. What I said refers to Amount A. Amount B, an important element of the Pillar 1 package, and I'm sure David can say also something about that. We understand it's an important part of the whole thing, and we heard from stakeholders that they would argue without a good solution on Amount B, I'm not so much interested in Amount A. At the same time, what we see is that we are far from a good solution on Amount B either. With only a few weeks left, a few meetings at the Working Party 6 left. So we hope that those outstanding issues can also be resolved in time, so that there is no argument along the lines to say, coming from some jurisdictions, to say, oh, I would have loved to sign up to Amount A, but since Amount B is not ready or not in a way that I would have liked to see it, I cannot sign up to it. Now, why are we so supportive as a Commission? It's very simple, because the counterfactual of a situation where we have no Pillar 1 is probably not a better situation, mainly for business, don't know, for advisors, maybe yes, maybe no, because most likely if there's no Pillar 1, there will be an avalanche of new DSTs. National DSTs, regional DSTs, differing to quite some degree, which doesn't make life easier and must be seen as a fragmentation of the international tax landscape. The good news on Pillar 1 I would like to share is that the Commission has no plans to come up with a legal instrument to transpose Pillar 1 in EU law. There were, quite frankly, some discussions internally, but to be quite honest, it doesn't make sense having a multilateral convention in place that has to be signed and ratified, and on top of it have something like a European directive. And I don't think there is sufficient appetite, despite the legal discussions behind it, out there to adopt something like this. To conclude on that, a small word on BFIT, since you raised it. I think it's a bit too early to discuss the interaction between Pillar 1 and BFIT, but of course we should be aware that there will be interactions. There will be questions about the sequencing of the different effects. Like Pillar 1, BFIT will also include once adopted by the Council, if it happens, a formulaic approach. It will lead to a reallocation of profits within the EU. And of course, the obvious question is, how will that interfere with the reallocation that is supposed to come from Pillar 1 for the M&Es in scope of Pillar 1? We as a Commission, we have said from the date of the adoption, which was mid of September of BFIT, let's take a bit of time for discussing BFIT. Also, if you look at the effective date that is foreseen in the directive, it's 2008. We fully recognize that we first need to move ahead with Pillar 2, with hopefully Pillar 1. And then we, in parallel, discuss BFIT and see how the interaction might be. And the implementation of BFIT should then come after that. BFIT being, in a nutshell, basically a replacement of national European tax frameworks. So the function or the role that the national tax framework plays within the Pillar 1 concept should just be replaced by BFIT. Of course, there will be some questions of interplay, but we will answer them when the time comes.
Thanks very much for that. David, I know there is so much that you could say on this. So the things I would most be interested in your contributions on are, What's our timeline for getting this thing signed? And I appreciate Reinhard calling my attention to the difference between signature and ratification. And how much time do we have before this avalanche of DSTs resumes?
Good questions, very good questions. And I certainly endorse all of what Reinhard has just had to say. In terms of where we're up to, the timing and what we can expect, I think it's worth noting that we had the outcome statement that was issued in July, and the expectation was that with there being sufficient progress with signature of the convention by the end of the year, that the standstill arrangements would remain in place. Now, of course, with the US seeking to undertake a process of requesting public input on the MLC, that means it is unlikely that we will be able to resolve these issues and have the convention open for signature before the end of the year. Now, as Reinhard said, there are a small number of issues where some outstanding unresolved issues remain for a relatively small group of countries. So the issues predominantly relate to the marketing and distribution safe harbor and specific elements of that. Now, I think at a technical level, there are a range of possibilities in terms of how some of these issues may be overcome. So I think that there is an opportunity to work through those issues. In terms of Canada had it had concerns about the outcome statement because it had the standstill provision, but Canada is actually very supportive of the MLC text that has been released. So I wouldn't even put them in the group of countries that have expressed reservations in terms of the MLC text. In terms of the US, and this is always a really important part of the discussion because, as we know, a significant proportion of the in-scope multinationals for the MLC, for the coordinated reallocation of taxing rights under Amount A, are US headquartered MNEs. And it goes without saying that the system won't work unless you have significant buy-in from those countries that have a large proportion of in-scope MNEs, of which the US is at the top of the list. So having the US not only agree to the text, but then sign the MLC and ultimately ratify it is going to be crucial. Now, I think we all have our own understanding of the challenges that the US political system generates in terms of securing ratification of an international agreement. And I think the easiest way to really summarize that is to note that it would require some degree of bipartisan support in the Congress. And that's why the initiative that the US administration has undertaken in requesting public input, I think should be seen as a positive step because it's one that really is evidence of the administration's commitment to not only progressing the MLC to agreement and signature, but to continue the process of engagement, excuse me, the process of engagement with the Congress, which is going to be important if Amount A is to be implemented. So I think at that level, it's an important and positive step, but it will mean that we will not have an MLC agreed and open for signature before the end of the year. I think that as soon as that public input process comes to a conclusion on the 11th of December, we'll be very keen, as will all members of the inclusive framework, to come back together and to continue the discussions with a view towards trying to bring that to its completion. Now, we are hopeful that we can continue the process moving towards signature in the first half of next year. But obviously, these are ongoing negotiations. There are still some unresolved outstanding issues. But I think that if we just step back for 1 minute and reflect upon the fact that we do have a text, which is the consensus of most countries in the inclusive framework. Yes, there are a couple of important countries that are still working through some of those issues and are being very constructive in the process. But that is actually a significant step forward. And Reinhard said that there are many people that think this will never happen, but I have to say there are many people that have said that there'll never be such a thing as an MLC text. So we are in that phase of the discussion. So a lot of work still to be done, consensus still to be built, but I think that the evidence of the MLC text with what really reflects a very large degree of consensus, even the three countries that have raised some concerns about certain issues, they are very much on board for the bulk of the provisions that are contained within that MLC. So we're close, we're not there yet, and it won't be a Christmas present. So don't be getting up on the 25th of December expecting too much at that point. But hopefully this is something that can be a New Year's resolution that can be delivered.
So since you have the floor, and particularly given our hybrid nature, I'm going to press you a little bit on your sense of consensus given what happened last week, where we had a large group of countries, primarily from Africa, who feel that they're excluded from the process, that they're not making money off the process, and who would like to break the ceasefire, I suspect, on the digital services taxes, as might other countries. So how do we square that?
Yeah, look, to some extent, we observe something of a disconnect. Sometimes in the negotiations in the inclusive framework, it's fair to say that in negotiations like these, there aren't many countries that believe that they've got all of what they were looking for. There are always countries that are looking to advance their position beyond what might be a compromise or consensus-based outcome. But by and large, there has been a strong degree of buy-in from developing countries and African countries in particular. And it's no doubt because they have played a very significant role in shaping the final contours of this Amount A. Just to give a couple of examples, the nexus thresholds secured by developing countries, that's a win and a benefit for them. Tail end revenues, revenue sourcing, the various de minimis rules in relation to elimination of double taxation and MDSH. These are all provisions that are only in the agreement because of the very robust and effective advocacy of developing countries, and in particular, many African countries. Now, of course, there may well be debates and legitimate debates for people to have about the governance of these arrangements, but I think what I would encourage people to do is to focus not necessarily on the colour, the action, some of the rhetoric that you might see in the papers from time to time, but have a look at what's happening on the ground. And we continue to have very strong engagement from developing countries, and in particular African countries. We see, for example, in the case of ETAF, we see them issuing their own various guidance on how to implement the global minimum tax, the QDMTTs in particular. We see strong engagement around a whole range of these issues. We have new countries joining the inclusive framework, like Philippines and Kuwait in just the last couple of weeks. On the ground, I think there is a story to be told there of how this process is progressing. And I think that there is a very strong commitment to trying to secure the outcomes that the two-pillar solution offers. Of course, the international tax debate doesn't begin and end with the two pillars, and there are a whole range of additional issues that people might want to continue to advance and discuss, and they may want to do that at the OECD through the inclusive framework and its 145 members, or they may want to do that somewhere else like the United Nations. It's absolutely legitimate for countries to have those discussions, but I would just suggest that it's important to also look at what they're doing. We are engaging in a number of pilot projects with many African countries and many developing countries when it comes to implementation of the global minimum tax, and they're very happy to be involved in those processes.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very upbeat way of looking at how the UN and the OECD can complement each other. Jorge, bringing it back to Europe, where are you member states on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would like to make a comment also regarding the linkage about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 that was raised by some other colleagues. I mean, as at the European Council, I mean, there's been also statements in that sense. I think it's clear the linkage that it's seen also by member states. But I mean, we can remember when Pillar 2 directive was approved that there was a statement also showing the commitment towards Pillar 1, as Reinhard said. But I mean, I think it's very clear that even if they are linked, the time frame, the timelines are not the same ones. And I think this is recognized by everyone. And this is also something to bear in mind, that it's clear at the OECD level and we all have in mind. I mean, about Pillar 1 and what's going on in the Council, I mean, that's not much to say. As a Spanish presidency, of course, we were ready. I mean, it was announced by the Commission that there may be, as Reinhard said, a possibility of directive to be released. I mean, it was announced some months ago, but so we were ready to work in case it happened. But of course, it was not Commission's, but the delay in the process at the inclusive framework, that it arrived in a different moment towards our presidency. So I think that what's been going on among the member states, it's also a kind of coordination towards the OECD meetings, and that, as I mentioned, really in relation to the Pillar 2, this is also happening regarding the Pillar 1 meetings. Of course, in the Council itself, there's not much work that can be done towards in relation to the Pillar 1. I think it's important to mention this issue about the United Nations that was also mentioned by Philip at the beginning, and you've mentioned now. I think there's an important step that has been achieved during the Spanish presidency, which is a common position among from the European Union and the member states regarding the tax cooperation in UN. So there was a common position that was negotiated in the Council and was agreed by all member states in relation to those negotiations at the UN. So the first time that it happened. And that common position was very useful to those negotiations that has been going on in the UN before this resolution. As it has been said, all European member states has voted against that, but this was because of this common position that it was in a way done in New York, but it was thanks to this common position that was agreed that the European Union negotiated as a bloc, because we can talk about that one, but this is a process coming from a report of the Secretary General where several options were presented and member states supporting one different option to the one which has been finally approved at the UN. So, but I think it's important that this first time, this common position was agreed as a first time in the Council. And I think that, and talking about what's going on next, a new process will start from the beginning next year, because this resolution, which was approved, stated about creating a new framework, convention. So there will be negotiations in the future, and I think that this is something to take into account in the Council to continue working through a common position, because it's in the interest of all of us. It is important to say that it is I mean, why European member states voted against that? It was more in relation that we thought that it is important not to duplicate the work that is going on at the OECD level. I think that this is the main message. So it's not that we are against working at the UN in this common position. It is recognized all the work that has been done also there, and different work can be done there, but we may be careful not to duplicate what's this work, and that was the reason to have a different position to other jurisdictions in those negotiations. One additional word about BFIT. I mean, this was presented by the Commission in September. It was during the Spanish presidency. I mean, Reinhard already explained the linkage with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, so there's a lot of things to be taken into account. We, as a Spanish presidency, organized 3 working parties at the Council for presentation purposes. We could not initiate it. We could not initiate the real negotiation about this. And as Commission said, it was not the purpose. I think that all member states expressed in these initial working parties the need to pay attention to the most urgent things that we have on the table right now. In fact, I mean, translations were not ready to start negotiations. So I think we have this new animal on the table, and we may have to pay attention afterwards, but it's important to say that member states now are very much concentrated on what's going on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and this will be a step forward. This is the reason why the Spanish presidency didn't pursue more on this file. And last word about the digital DSTs, the digital service taxes. I think there's this linkage, as everyone says. There was already some proposals that were negotiated in the Council about this. It was all stopped because of this two-pillar solution. So I think that everybody's pushing to have a solution. So we really are there. We really hope that we find the solution in the end with this two-pillar solution. But if not, of course, this is something that we all have in mind, that it may come up again. In fact, some member states are still having their digital service taxes. So it's not that it disappeared. They are there, but it is clear that there may be more. So we really think that we should continue pushing for this solution and to be done soon and next year.
Yes. Thank you for those updates. Mona, we've heard so much official sector optimism. Do you share their optimism, or are there some other ways we might look at all of this?
So, of course, whether it's Pillar 1 or DSTs that we're talking about, I think the common thing is that everyone agrees on taxing multinationals. So at least there's like a common ground, even if the methods are very different. From the perspective of Pillar 1, even if today all the EU member states agrees to introduce Pillar 1, and with the rest of the world, with all countries agreeing, except the US, we cannot introduce Pillar 1 because of this critical mass condition. And even if there was no condition of critical mass, without the US, the revenues that would be reallocated through Pillar 1 would be very, very little. And that is because with respect to the thresholds that we have now, so Pillar 1, the covered groups in Pillar 1 are those that are the largest and the most profitable in the world. There's a threshold of revenues of 20 billion euros. So we are talking about only like 100 multinationals in the world. In one of our reports, we assessed that there's going to be around 68 to 69 multinationals that are going to be in scope of Pillar 1. And almost half of these are headquartered in the US. So that gives you an idea that the reallocated profits are going to be mostly from US multinationals. This is followed by Chinese multinationals and then the European multinationals, which are only 10, and for China it's around 13. This is, of course, according to our estimates. So the issue with Pillar 1 is that without the, of course, without the US on board, it cannot pass because the revenues would be too little. Now, of course, there are many voices saying that in case Pillar 1 falls apart, there's going to be, different countries that are going to probably reintroduce or reactivate their DSTs. This, of course, poses an issue because you would have many different legislations, many different rules that are going to be applied on multinationals. It might create a lot of double taxation. In Pillar 1, there was the elimination of double taxation it was a rule to ensure that multinationals are not going to end up with an increased tax burden. But at the same time, probably the elimination of double taxation in Pillar 1 was one of the reasons why several countries were afraid to engage in Pillar 1 with respect to Pillar 2. Because in Pillar 2, in Pillar 2, you are either gaining something or you are not gaining. But in Pillar 1, you might be losing because you might end up being a country that needs to pay back some taxing rights. So I think in the different designs, whether it's Pillar 1 or DSTs, some have positive aspects and negative aspects. And we're going to see how, in the upcoming month, how the debate around Pillar 1 and DSTs how they're going to converge. But of course, it's clear that whether you're on the side of DST or Pillar 1, there's a common interest of taxing the revenues from the digital economy.
Thanks very much for that. Christoph, we're running low on time, but since you are in a country that had a digital services tax and also had a little bit of a kerfuffle with the US about it, I was wondering if you had any brief thoughts on how this process is looking from the ground.
Yeah, first of all, it's not half, it's half, yeah? Because we still have a digital services tax. Yeah?
Good point.
From a practical perspective, Pillar 1 has been much more debated than Pillar 2 before the proposals or the draft model were published in 21. Yeah? I think the discussion back then was much more, will there be a virtual PE or something like that? Yeah? So that was what triggered interest in Austria and in Austrian literature. Since we know the final concept of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, this changed dramatically. Yeah? So in practice, there's not much interest in Pillar 1. Yeah? The reason is basically there's not even one company in Austria that will be covered by Amount A. Yeah? Maybe there's one. Yeah? We're not quite sure about that yet, but potentially there's not even one company that is covered, which means, of course, there's no need for advice in this respect. Amount B, of course, is much more interesting also for Austrian companies because it doesn't have the same scope. Yeah? It's not limited to those around 100 companies in the world. It has a much broader scope, and it's much more interesting in practice. Yeah? So with regard to Pillar 1, I would say that the digital services tax in Austria, the practical relevance is not that big. It is important for foreign companies that have to pay those digital services tax in Austria. Except from that, it's not triggered a lot of attention. It's more or less a topic for only a handful of people in Austria that really understand this digital services tax. Amount B is much more heavily debated, and companies are much more interested in this topic. They see a potential that, from a transfer pricing perspective, it will provide some potential to make things easier, but it's also seen that it might also have the potential to make things even more complicated, if you, depending on what the final outcome on amount B is. So from an Austrian perspective, I would say amount B is practically much more debated than amount A, and this is due to the reason there are not many companies that will be covered, or no companies in Austria at least, that will be covered by amount A. And from the ministry, I think the only thing we can say is that if Pillar 1 will be implemented, then our DST will be history.
Thanks very much for that. Before we turn it back to Philippe, Reinhard, do you have anything you'd like to come back to, or any closing thoughts for us about what we can look forward to in the next months?
We're all looking forward to Christmas, I think. Now, one element I wanted to pick up very briefly, that's the question of what do we actually want to address with Pillar 1? And it was mentioned in several interventions here. Actually, it was set up and designed to address the digital economy. And looking back, it was actually the US during the discussions who said, hey, why should it actually be limited to digital companies? Let's broaden the scope and bring in all kinds of sectors and industries. Now, that was, I don't know whether it was smart or it was not well enough considered, but fact is that the threat that we could use now to say, if you don't agree, or if agreement on Pillar 1 cannot be reached, you will be bombarded by different digital service taxes, does not work well with non-digital companies. And that is probably why in the US, the non-digital industries, brick and mortar industries say, I cannot be bothered too much by Pillar 1 because I will also not have to fear any digital service tax in the future. So why should I be actually promoting this model? We'll see how it turns out in the end. It seems Treasury is still at least halfway optimistic that they can get their stakeholders behind it.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you all for coming. Thank you online. Philippe, would you like to close out our conversation, please?
Thank you for your attention during this debate. I would like to thank warmly all the speakers, but really your contribution was much needed for our understanding of the current implementation of the two-pillar solution. And the big thank to you, Rebecca. You did that very well. We have managed the debate with perfection. So thank you very much. I think that it was important to highlight the difficulties policymakers and tax advisors may face in the future, whether it's the way in which the European Union will take account of the OECD guidance or the implementation time frame. It was also essential and timely to provide to the public an update on the state of the progress of the Pillar 1 and the impact that the US may have in developing this process. As tax professionals, it's our role to remain vigilant in identifying and reporting any implementation challenges we may face along the way, and to continue working closely with policymakers and tax authorities to ensure that the two-pillar solution implementation achieves its intended objective without creating undue burdens for taxpayers. We all are afraid of burdens. So once again, thank you everyone for your contribution. I hope you enjoy the debate, and it's my pleasure now to invite you for to have a glass. It will be outside of the room, by the side here at the bar. So I hope we can continue discussing and exchanging on that topic. Many thanks.
Thank you.